Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Billy Napier and the Florida Gators wasting no time at all addressing the departure of Dontre Robinson as former Baylor defensive lineman Brandon Bett scheduled to come into Gainesville today, take a visit on Saturday afternoon, and we'll see if Florida can wrap this one up relatively quickly. Now, we're going to get a little bit more into Brandon Bett, who's a guy that I'll just put my hand up and say was not too familiar with until I was sitting down Friday morning drinking my cup of coffee and he kind of came across the Florida Gators radar. Really intriguing kid. Missed the whole 2024 year, but you go back to his 2023 true freshman year, played over 200 snaps as a true freshman for Baylor, really emerged later on in the 2023 season. And I'll say this, doing some reading on Brendan Bett, coming out of spring practice for Baylor, this was a kid that I don't think Baylor wanted to lose. And so although it's not that marquee name that we're all familiar with or seen him play a lot, this is a guy that you probably trust going into year 3 of his college football career that can come in and give you quality rotational snaps on the defensive line. And look, I think a lot of Florida fans who follow this program pretty damn closely probably agree that that's all we need in the transfer portal. Unless you go get a guy like Gooden from USF, there's not a ton of guys that are going to come in and be All-Americans. In fact, Florida already has their All-American in Caleb Banks. We just need rotational bodies behind him that we trust to give us solid snaps. And I think Brendan Bett is kind of that intriguing combination of, look, we trust that he can play quality rotational snaps, but also only going into year 3, coming off a 2023 true freshman season where he played some significant snaps, there might be a little bit more upside with a guy like Brendan Bett as well. So you're getting rotational snaps with a little exposure to some upside. That makes a lot of sense. If I'm Billy Napier and the Florida Gators. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about Brandon Bett, but I want to start with the process that we've seen from Florida as it pertains to the transfer portal, really going back to the winter and the spring. We talked about it yesterday. Florida is being ultra aggressive in terms of retaining the talent on their roster. And from the sounds of it, even guys like Dontre Robinson and Gregory Smith, Florida did everything they could to keep those cats within the program. They wanted to leave. They wanted to kind of look for other opportunities. There's a process, and I think there's principles for Billy Napier, very similar to what I think we saw unfold with Nico at Tennessee, where it's like, hey, we're going to be aggressive to retain our players, but we're not going to get outside of a process, and we're not going to overpay players and get into these bidding wars, especially for guys that are probably rotational pieces in the 2025 year. You don't see Florida losing Caleb Banks to the NFL draft. You don't see Florida losing Austin Barber, Jake Slaughter, Jaden Ball, Miles Graham, the young talent that we expect to be difference makers for Florida, or just all the talent at all from that 2024 season. Florida has been ultra aggressive at keeping that talent. And in my opinion, they've done a really good job. And then I think the second part is the spring transfer portal window, at least in my opinion, is really just for putting out fires. And I think you have a little bit of a fire that emerged, so to speak, with Florida, losing Dontre Robinson, already kind of being thin at that position. We don't have to go out what you look at this roster, you look at this depth chart and say, how many players currently in the spring portal window would be above and away clear upgrades from what Florida has on both sides of the football. Because when I look at it, I just don't see that many holes and that many flaws. And when you're choosing between, hey, let's just go make sure we pay a guy that's been within our program for 3 years, or choose to pay a guy a little bit more coming into the program who hasn't been within the program for the last couple of years, you're going to lean to the guy that's been within the program, that's gone through spring practice, that understands what Florida's doing on both sides of the football. That's in my opinion, my humble opinion, sitting in my basement in Rochester, New York, that's the strategy. You can use the transfer portal and go out and make additions that your roster needs, but you don't have to go out and just bring in players to bring in players. And where I think Florida sits from a roster standpoint, and look, I've been critical and I've been complimentary of Billy Napier. I'll give him a big compliment right now. You don't see a lot of red coloring on this depth chart because Florida has done a really good job evaluating out of high school, developing talent to the point where you didn't need to go to the portal and go out and grab 20 to 25 players because you've eaten your vegetables the last couple of years and you've done it the right way. And I know the you might say results have not come in the way a lot of Florida fans wanted. And quite frankly, I would agree with Florida fans. Like, I don't think this team has played the way we sometimes have expected them to play, but the process has been there. Billy Napier was not like Lane Kiffin. He didn't come into this program, let everybody walk, and just use the transfer portal and bring in a whole new roster. We built this thing the right way to the point that we're going into 2025. Now we're going to kind of reap the rewards that we've sown by eating our vegetables and doing things the right way the last couple of years. That's kind of where I think Florida is. Now, you do have a fire that's kind of building, right? And I think a lot of Florida fans who follow this roster pretty closely see it. Outside of Caleb Banks, we don't have a ton of, not necessarily trust, but there's not a ton of proven commodities, right? You have Jamari Lyons coming off an injury. You have Mackay going into year 2. You have Stephon Shivers being a true freshman. Brian Taylor, Tarvos Brown, guys we haven't seen play a ton at the SEC level. You got to go get bodies that you trust to play. Now, I want to get into Brandon Bett a little bit more, talk about a few other options that Florida could pursue. Before we get into it, as always, the Florida fans, appreciate you guys. And I'll start with this. It's nice to see Florida and Billy Napier showing some urgency. I don't think there was a ton of urgency with this roster at other positions, but I think for a lot of Florida fans, you kind of recognize, hey, we got to fix this problem quickly before we go into 2025. And it does seem to be like Billy Napier is going out and doing it. And hopefully we got a commitment to break down over the next 48 hours. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If you all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And look, Brandon Bett, again, what stands out to me here is, all right, he didn't play at all in 2024. 200 plus snaps as a true freshman, that stands out. And you start looking at when he played the snaps, it was very clear that towards the end of that true freshman year, Brandon Bett emerged as a guy that Baylor really liked in the middle of the defensive line as a true freshman. And so now he missed the 2024 year, ideally put on a little bit more weight, got a little bit more physically developed. Going into 2025, everything you read coming out of spring practice was this was not a guy Baylor wanted to lose. And Florida fans understand that. You've had some guys that have left this program over the last couple of months, a guy like Deuce Spurlock. It's not a shot at Deuce Spurlock. It's just like, it makes sense that he left. It wasn't necessarily a guy that Florida fans were really upset to see leave. Brandon Bett's not that guy. I don't think Baylor fans, I don't think that Baylor staff was thrilled when he entered his name into the transfer portal, which, kind of tells me this is a guy that probably can play for Florida in 2025. And again, what intrigues me the most is this is not a fifth-year senior that you kind of know what he is. This is a guy that's only going into year 3, missed all of 2024, played very well as a freshman. There is some upside too. It's not only a proven commodity, there's some upside. And that's kind of hard to find in the spring transfer portal window. Another name that I'd probably just throw out there is George Rooks from Boston College. As a Michigan fan, familiar with this kid, committed to Michigan out of high school. Look, went to Boston College. Now, this is a little bit more of an example of what he is. He's not going to come in with this super high ceiling, potentially all SEC kind of guy. He's a guy that he's going to come in, give you a 15 to 20 quality snaps a game. That's probably going to be it. Now, he's played over 800 snaps the last 2 years, and that's what stands out to me is like, look, we know this kid can play at the Power 4 level because he's done it for the last couple of years at Boston College. I don't think he comes in and becomes a first-team All-SEC guy, but it's a rotational body that we trust. These kind of guys are important. You want to get the best out of Caleb Banks. You don't want to have to play him 500 snaps a game. You got to have guys like George Rooks that you can rotate in there and really not be liabilities. It takes me back to the year Florida had Gervon Dexter, who was a force in the middle of that defensive line. But, Florida had zero depth behind him. I believe they played Gervon Dexter almost 650 snaps that year. It's not how you get the best out of him. Gervon Dexter was playing not fresh for most of the season. You want to get the best out of a guy like Caleb Banks. Make sure you have some bodies that you can rotate in and keep a guy like Caleb Banks fresh. The other name to monitor is Zaquan Patterson, and I'll start with this. To me, I wouldn't be upset if Florida went out and grabbed Zaquan Patterson. Like, this is a guy that has 3 years of eligibility remaining, plus a redshirt year, was a top 100 kid coming out of high school. Like, we think he can be a very good football player, and I know you're trying to replace a guy like Gregory Smith. But at the end of the day, from what we've heard from Drake Stubbs, from what we heard from a guy like Lagonza Hayward, is the safety position that much of a concern? And from what it sounds like, this is a little bit of an NIL type thing too. Is it worth going and shelling out a ton of money when you kind of like the young talent that you have in the safety room? Like, kind of going back to where we started this conversation, and that is the spring portal window to me is it should be focused on putting out fires. Coming out of spring practice, you look at your roster and say, hey, what are the one or two positions that we have to address before we kick off in 2025? To me, you got one. It's the middle of the defensive line. And I don't know if Florida should be worrying about other positions right now. Like, go fix the interior defensive line, and this team can be dangerous in 2025. The team's already going to be dangerous. You just want to put the cherry on top. That's kind of my view on it. I love having these conversations, these like roster building, nitty gritty conversations. We'll see where Florida decides to go. I'm going to do a little bit of watching Brandon Bett. So if he does commit to Florida, I'll have a little bit more of a commentary on the player that you're getting. But I do think that's an intriguing name to keep an eye on if you're a Florida fan. We'll sign out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.